my co-anchor, I guess, or my co-author, okay, for and nodded to Mr. Williams to Principal. The boy nodded solemnly. God, solemnly. Hello dears, Natalie Locke here with episode 95 of Write the Story, where I give you a prompt in 10 words out of this book, share with you my outlining and drafting process, and even give you a chance to join in on writing the story. Now, when I say the story, I mean a flash fiction, and a flash fiction is anything 1,000 words or less. The way I normally do this, I take 5-10 minutes to outline in this book, and then I take 20 minutes, let's face it, it's usually more, could be up to an hour, to actually write the story. I don't give myself a time limit on these videos, but if you want to see me on a time limit, I can usually write about 500 words, maybe less, on Flash Fiction Live, which is either on my channel or my co-chair Chandra Author's channel every single Saturday at 8:30 a.m. Now, if this is the first time you're doing flash fiction, I recommend don't set a time limit. If you've been doing this a little bit of time, you can even throw in a challenge like Chandra and I do for the second prompt on Flash Fiction Live. Feel free to take part in that. But for now, let me just give you episode 95's prompt in 10 words. The prompt is, the villain is really the hero. The words to include are witchcraft, recommend, sand dollar, fisticuff, paprika, eyeball, nightlight, gibberish, infuriating, and dreadful. Now, with this story, it was kind of difficult to figure out how I was going to formulate it. I think what I ended up doing, and a lot of it is internal, so hopefully I can try to formulate exactly what went through my head. But I decided, what is the end result? And I picked the end result of this person is taking care of their brother. Well, why are they taking care of their brother? What are they doing? And I was like, well, maybe their brother's in a wheelchair and they take care of him, or somebody. I didn't even pick brother at that time, but I was like, they're taking care of someone else, because that's usually the semblance of a hero, is taking care of someone that is not yourself. And then I was like, all right, how are they taking care of them? What do they need? What does this person need? And why do they need help? If it was an emergency life or death, those situations happen too quickly for me to even get a full story out of it. But let's say the situation's out of the people's hands because the main characters are children. And then that's how I was able to come up with this plan of an older brother clearing the hallway for his little brother who's in a wheelchair, and a new kid who didn't know about this but saw someone going, get out of the way, move, as a bully, and they just left their school because of bullies, and they were like, not again, and they stood up for themselves. And how that unfolds, I'm actually quite proud of myself for how I had that unfold. So let me go ahead and give you how the outline came out about. If you've been here before, you know that with my outline, I just take those 10 words and I just plaster them in there, and it's kind of like sticking to a wall. And then when I write the story, I make the little red ribbon yarn tie between each word. That's kind of how I work when it comes to these flash fictions. And sometimes my points that the yarn is tied to, they move. I still use that point, that word, but I do use it in a different way. So here's how I ended up originally thinking how I was going to use these 10 words. First, I thought, one fisticuff and you're a troublemaker. I kind of kept that, but I ended up adding a third person in here than the two people fighting. I've already imagined the second bullet I have is that it's a school bully saying, clear the way, like they're taking over the hallway. And I was thinking the bully would say, I recommend you back up. to this other person. But I ended up not using recommend that way. I used it for the third person that came in, which, by the way, is the principal. Spoiler alert. Witchcraft. With that word, I was making it almost facetious, be like, I don't know what witchcraft was done here. Where obviously it wasn't witchcraft, but they just decided to use the word. That worked, and I kept that in its sense, but I gave it to someone else to say. For eyeball, I was thinking for eyeball, like maybe their eyeball was very visible while they were squinting because maybe there was swelling already. Ended up not using eyeball in that way. For gibberish, I was thinking kids saying curse words underneath their mouth, but it just sounded like gibberish to the adults around them. Ended up not using it that way, but I did keep gibberish in the mumbling sense, so I would count that as the word staying the same. One thing that did stay, and it really, when I edit, this is probably going to fall off, or maybe it probably needs to be developed more, but as it stands, it's one of the characters had a sand dollar keychain that was broken, and that's how I use that line. I don't know. I kind of need to either development more, give that sand dollar more sentimental value, or just cut it completely. For infuriating, I was thinking, and this was like the last word that I added here. For infuriating, I was thinking the parents were infuriated that they had to take off work to come to the school. But that ended up changing, so I ended up not using infuriating that way, but I did keep infuriating as an emotion for one of the characters. A line that was specific in my outline and it stayed specific in the story is, "This is dreadful behavior." Kept that. Paprika, I was thinking maybe someone mispronounced someone's name and they thought it was paprika, but I couldn't figure out a name that could be close enough to paprika to make that work. So I ended up changing that to actually describe a type of food for lunch. And the last thing in the outline is, the biggest bullies are usually the scaredest and probably sleep with the nightlight. And I ended up kind of keeping the essence of that, but didn't use it verbatim as it is here. So out of 10 words, 6 stayed the same in their essence, and I'm happy with the story. So let me go ahead and read to you my version of episode 95. "What dreadful behavior, 2 students fighting," Principal Hammond said while shaking her head. She stood behind her desk with 2 scruffy students who kept their jaws tight, hands in their lap, and their eyes on the wall behind their disappointed principal. Principal Hammond put her hands on her hips and eyed the stockier of the 2 boys. "Mr. Fraser, you are a 5th grader, the highest grade here, and other kids look up to you. I expect you to set the example." She turned to the smaller boy who was suppressing a smirk. "And Mr. Williams, this is your first week. Is this how you want to start off at a new school?" "No, ma'am," the skinnier boy said. His gaze dropped to his hands. "Now, I don't know what sort of witchcraft made you boys turn on each other, but I highly recommend you both fess up to what led to this fisticuff." Both boys looked up with identical furrowed brows. The principal pursed her lips. "It means the fight." The boys nodded, but stayed silent. "Well," she said, eyeing them both, "who wants to tell me what happened?" The smaller of the 2 boys cleared his throat. "Eric broke my sand dollar keychain, and I was only standing up to the school bully," he said in one breath. "What?" Eric snapped. "Mr. Fraser, let Mr. Williams speak," the principal interjected. Eric sucked in his bottom lip with a huff. Principal Hammond nodded to Mr. Williams to continue. "As I said," the Williams boy eyed Eric through gritted teeth before turning to the principal, "I can spot a bully right away. They're usually the ones who sleep with nightlights and walk down hallways like they own the school. I stood up for myself." He coughed before speaking again, but his voice still cracked at the end. "And I don't want to change schools again." "I do not act like I own," Eric said before Principal Hammond cut him off. "Mr. Fraser, I will not ask you again. Wait your turn." Principal Hammond raised her voice slightly. Eric clenched his jaw as he pressed his back against the chair. Principal Hammond turned to the other boy and gently said, "Mr. Williams, your mother informed me of your mid-semester move. Don't worry, we have a zero-tolerance bullying policy here. But, as Mr. Fraser has listened to your side of the story, I ask you hear his." The boy nodded solemnly. "Mr. Fraser, thank you for your patience. Will you please share your side of the story?" Eric nodded and began. I was headed to lunch with my brother, clearing the hallway because, "See, I told you," the other boy said. The principal raised her eyebrows at him as he slumped into his chair, mumbling gibberish that sounded like sorry. Eric took a breath before speaking again. "It's infuriating, I admit, when people won't move out of the way. So I may have been mean when I asked him to move out of the way. There was plenty of room for you to walk by. Why did I have to move?" The small boy whipped around to face his bully. "My brother needed the extra room, not— Yeah, well, what entitles him to the prince treatment?" Eric opened his mouth, but then stopped himself. He turned his head and finally said, "You're new, right?" The other boy nodded and stayed silent, his arms folded across his chest. "Not sure if you noticed while you were telling me to make you move, but my brother is in a wheelchair. That's why I clear the hallway for him," Eric said rather harshly. The boy's eyes grew wide. "Oh," was all he let out. "Yeah, oh," Eric mimicked. "Maybe next time you'll use your eyeballs." "Mr. Fraser, your tone and choice of words are not in line with our school policy," Principal Hammond warned. "Now, both of you were in the wrong here. It takes two to fight, but it also takes two to make amends. The solution I propose to this mishap is you both join forces." Both boys' eyes darted between each other and Principal Hammond. She smiled as she continued. "Mr. Fraser, I think you could use some help getting your brother to lunch. And Mr. Williams, I believe your assertiveness would be an asset in helping Mr. Fraser help his brother to lunch." Their jaws dropped. "Or I could call your parents back and ask them to come to the school," she offered. Their jaws bounced off the floor as they shook their heads. Principal Hammond nodded with a smile and walked around her desk to open her office door the rest of the way. "Very well then. Off to lunch, you both. I believe they're serving paprika chicken today." The boys spared a glance at each other before hurrying to freedom. While walking to lunch in silence, Eric finally spoke up. "Well, we meet at 11:10 by the boys' bathrooms every day. Guess you can eat with us too. I won't be calling you Mr. Williams, though." The smaller boy laughed. "I'm Brian, and I'll be there." Well, once again, is anyone surprised? I kind of went a cutesy route with this, but it's okay. The problems I had with this story is trying to figure out organically how to have the principal speaking, both boys speaking, having differentiation between the boys, and it was difficult for me. It was that dynamic with tags, trying to show age, trying to convey a structure here, but what I am proud of myself for is the slow unfolding of the story, because we start out with two kids got into a fight. Okay, well, why? And then you find out, well, this guy was kind of a bully. He was making people get out of the way, and then you kind of find out that the boy who is the new kid in school, he kind of was triggered. He had PTSD. He had dealt with bullies. At least that's what my headcanon is, and hopefully that came across in the story. And so there's these multi-aspects to it, and I do enjoy that fact where I gave two boys actually multi-dimension, where you knew what their goals were and such. And I really enjoyed that. What I think I really needed to work on is the wording, and I didn't want too much knowledge to be known by the characters, but at the same time I didn't want the principal to be personable, because growing up, for me, most of my teachers, they never called me by my first name. It was always Miss and then my maiden name growing up, obviously because I wasn't married then. So I really didn't want to have a teacher that calls the students by their first name in this, especially a principal. I needed to work on that dialogue dynamic, which is funny because I actually think dialogue is one of my strong suits. I'm usually very heavy in dialogue. It's the interaction with the world that I've created the dialogue in that I always have issues with. But this time, I think by having three people in a room, two of them the same gender, it really kind of messed up my jumping back and forth. But being third person, I think it helped. A way it could have been fixed is if I put this in the perspective of one of the boys. And I think the only way that I could have changed that and made this story powerful enough with that nice twist at the end of like, oh, that's the full story, as if I wrote it from the new kid's point of view. So I think that's my least favorite. That's the area that I need to work on, is figuring out the dynamic of like dialogue tags and getting the characters distinct enough in their voice. Now for my favorite line. It's actually an entire section, and it's when Principal Hammond is dishing out the solution, how to make amends between the two boys. And one, I'm proud that I said, call your parents back. Because I was like, wait a second. As I was writing this, I was like, I don't want anyone to think that the school didn't call the parents. In my mind, the parents were called, but they said, hey, we can handle it here. You don't have to come in. We just want to inform you of what occurred. And I kind of like that aspect. But then I like this non-verbals back and forth between the boys and Principal Hammond as she speaks. She comes out with saying, Mr. Fraser, I think you could use some help getting your brother to lunch. And Mr. Williams, I believe your assertiveness would be an asset in helping Mr. Fraser help his brother to lunch. Their jaws drop because now they realize, oh my God, we're working together. Then she says, or I could call your parents back and ask them to come to the school, she offered. Their jaws bounce off the floor as they shake their heads. No, like that, such a kid thing of like, first you hear the first option, you're like, what? And then you hear the second option, you're like, first option's great, perfect, well, sounds great, you're a genius, thank you. And that to me is like the epitome of a kid and how kids react, is at first like, what, no way. And I'm hoping I was able to convey that they were kids by their lack of self-control in interrupting each other, but they're still smart kids because they kind of realize a good deal when they see it too in this line, and they both pick their jaws back up and go, yep, and race to freedom once they get the chance. That's where I'm at with this story. I really enjoyed it. 860 words, so long, but I'm happy with it. I think there's some more areas I could work with. I did have some issues in my writing with this, but the meat and potatoes are there, and I'm hungry. So I am continuing to find joy in my story, and I hope you are finding joy in whatever passion you have every single day, every single week, every month, and every year.